Greetings, fellow seekers, dreamers, heads, gnostics, magicians, witches, and other assorted wonderful freaks of the 21st century. It is I, Tom Hatsis, your psychedelic historian, here with episode 3 of the Psanctum Oddcast, featuring Chris Bennett and Brian Muraresku. Psanctum Psychedelia is a psychedelics education and harm reduction organization based in Portland, Oregon. We are also the curators of the world's largest repository of psychedelic literature that you can check out at sanctum.org. And please remember that we survive solely based on your tax-free donations and Patreon support. I'm really excited for this conversation because I consider both Chris and Brian to be two of the brightest minds in the field of psychedelic history. Additionally, all three of us have read each other's books, know each other's arguments, and have had countless side conversations about all the things that we discuss in this episode. So on that, without any further ado, it is my great pleasure to bring to you the Psanctum Oddcast Episode 3 featuring Chris Bennett and Brian Muraresku. Enjoy.
Sure, I'm Brian, and I have a relatively new book out called The Immortality Key, The Secret History of the Religion with No Name, which is essentially my 12-year investigation looking into the original sacraments of Western civilization and marrying the humanities and the sciences in an effort to try and figure out what our ancient ancestors were actually up to.
Awesome. And Bennett?
And I'm Chris Bennett. I've written a number of books on the role of cannabis in magic and religion over the last 30 years. Green Gold, The Tree of Life, Marijuana and Magic and Religion, which came out in 1995. Sex, Drugs, Violence in the Bible, which explored the references to cannabism as cannabis, and that came out in 2001. Cannabis and the Soma Solution, which I feel presented really solid archaeological and textual evidence for the role of cannabis in the Soma and Heoma preparations, and most recently, Liber 420, Cannabis, Magical Herbs, and the Occult.
Well, excellent. Great. Well, welcome both of you to the Psanctum Oddcast. I'm sorry, again, I'm really bad at introductions and things like that. So the one thing that I've actually been wanting to ask you, Brian, since reading The Immortality Key, is I have, along with almost everyone I can think of, we have all been pronouncing Kukion wrong.
I know.
How did that happen? That literally, like, I have been this whole time I'm like Kaikion. And I'm like,
there are two recurring questions at the top of the top 10 questions. Number one is, do I have Romanian roots? The answer to which is yes. And number two, how do you pronounce that word? And I mean, I pronounce it. It's not the way a modern Greek would pronounce it. I have what's known as an Erasmian pronunciation. It's the way ancient Greek was taught to me. It is an upsilon in Kukion. The way most of those come into English is it goes into a Y, like huper, like hypochondriac is hypochondriac. So that's also an upsilon that transfers in. So, I mean, technically, Kikion is not incorrect. I'm being pedantic when I say Kukion, but I think they're both correct.
Oh, God, that's a load off my mind. Yeah. No, but so as far as let's see, with Bennett, because what a lot of what the Immortality Key has to do with are these different, the idea of different kinds of psychedelic beers and wines, and you bring up that really interesting, the lizard potion, the lizard wine. What a find. I mean, to have all of those ingredients there. What was it, cannabis, opium, nightshade, or something?
And henbane.
Sure, and Bennett, you're aware of a bunch of recipes like that as well, yeah? Different psychedelic wines?
Well, there's evidence of Scythian wines, Rudenko, apparently there was a cup with residue of cannabis-infused wine in it and I believe a wineskin. And they found more recently, there's been a number of articles about these gold cups misrepresented as bongs in the mainstream media, but they were gold cups and they showed residues of cannabis and opium used by the Scythians. In France, 2,000 years ago, there's evidence of a cannabis-infused wines. And then there's textual evidence in the Zoroastrian literature under the terms banga and then the Pahlavi translation of banga mang, which are thought to be cannabis. There has been arguments that this is a reference to henbane, largely from Flattery and Schwartz, but they also claim there was no evidence of cannabis used as a psychoactive before the medieval period. And a lot of their research is based on that. There was confusion about the term banga in the Islamic period. It did get applied to henbane a bit then, but the old world references, Zoroastrian, Indo-European references, you see the same term in Hindu, and it's all part of that, the words that developed from the Proto-Indo-European term kana that went into all the different Indo-European languages, right? So it's part of that. And those are quite clear recipes for cannabis infused into wine. And I think there's other, Democritus, he wrote about a variety of infused wines coming from the Bactria Margiana region, which is interesting because this is where Syrian had found his alleged Soma temple with evidence of cannabis, opium, and ephedra at it, right? And, there's, other things as well. Yeah, there's a variety of things, I think.
Sure, no, absolutely. You mentioned cannabism for a moment there, and one of the things that has always kind of struck me that's odd, not about the term cannabism, but that it's not seen as cannabis, by many people, except for a few, like I would imagine, the three of us know. Brian, do you have thoughts on that? Like the whole idea of the linguistic ties of cannabism to other languages in the surrounding areas of Israel in the ancient world, or different Hebraic areas, I should say, in the ancient world, and how
Yeah, I'm aware of the scholarship. I didn't look too much into it, but it's funny. The recent find at Tel Arad is really interesting, and I know that Chris has picked up on this too. It's one thing to look at the literature, and obviously we all do lots of that. And I love Tom's work. I love Chris's work. I mean, it's part of putting these pieces together. What blew me away is that the archaeochemical find, not just archaeobotanical, the archaeochemical evidence for THC, right? Not just the lesser cannabinoids, if they can be called lesser, but I mean THC actually discovered in the Holy Land.
It was a resin product.
Yeah, it's really, really impressive. I mentioned it at the very end of my book.
Yeah.
Just because together with some of that spiked wine and spiked beer, I think it paints a really compelling picture and what I call proof of concept to really be investigating this stuff in a multidisciplinary fashion. The fact that there was cannabis incense being used for psychoactive purposes, according to the authors of that paper, just released in May, I think is extraordinarily compelling.
And this find, I want to point out, fits perfectly with the cannabism references. And these were first identified by the Polish entomologist and anthropologist Sula Bennett, who wrote about it first in 1936. And Brian's mentor, Carl Ruck, as well, has talked about this. Both Ruck and I differentiated from Sula Bennett, who thought it was a Semitic term that made its way into Indo-European languages. We both see it as evidence of a Indo-European term, likely coming through Scythians, And it's interesting, Brian's mention of Scythopolis, I want to get back to that, and that it made its way into the Hebrew language, right? And we see this term, a very similar term in Assyria and Babylonia, where it's more accepted, Kanabu is more accepted as cannabis by Assyriologists, but used in an identical way, in oils, incenses, in the temple, and used in an identical way. There's even records of, purchasing it and things like that for temple use. And, in relation to, Scythopolis, the Scythians, Pat McGovern wrote about it as well. He speculated on a cannabis-infused wine, but as far as I know, from Rudenko and through these golden goblets, which showed evidence of cannabis and opium, it's not clear if the gold goblets showed that it was a wine infusion or some other preparation that it was infused with. There's not a lot written on it. It's Russian research mostly. But there's definitely, a lot of talk about it and other evidence, as I said. I think that makes much better case for the Dionysian wine being cannabis infused as well. And Ruck has actually suggested this in the past as well, that cannabis likely came into Greece through Greek infusions of Dionysian wine, and looking at the connections that have been made by Lane Danilo and others between Dionysius and Shiva is also a strong connection, and Eliade as well, suggested cannabis use by Thracian followers of Dionysius as well. The kapnobate, those who walk in smoke, and this smoke has generally been interpreted as cannabis smoke by a variety of scholars, right? So there we have the term getting into Israel, and evidence from both sides of Brian's argument, and in infused wine. So I just want to add one more thing. Amos says, refers to the wine of the condemned and craft in the house of God. So this is like an infusion that has been referred to by a number of scholars going back a century and up to modern times, and has been interpreted as some sort of cannabis infusion in wine used by the Jews for pain and relief and for visionary purposes. So there's some pretty interesting stuff there, I think, that fits well with Brian's research. Maybe not so well with your gut stuff, but some of the other stuff he's written about infused wine and history. I think there's a lot to back it up.
Oh, yeah, that's what I was thinking while I was digesting his book over the past 2 weeks, was like, wow, like so much, like I think that there's a lot that it's pretty much been proven at this point. I mean, if you want my honest, take on it. And I think that because it's been bolstered by these different kinds of discoveries, especially recently, like the cannabis one or the, any number of ones that we've all written about. So moving into, let's see, we've all written about entheogenic and psychedelic Christianity from different angles in some areas, and in other ways similar areas, as far as their adopting of what we might consider earlier or polytheistic potions and ritual sacraments. And I wanted to kind of get into that a little bit, but I don't know where to begin with it, because it's such an odd, so Brian, you brought up a lot, let's start here, because I remember this from your book, the Gospel of John a lot. And it's where you see overlaps with John and the Dionysian motifs from earlier days. To be honest with you, as much as I loved your book, I wasn't totally sold on it. And I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind elaborating more, maybe getting into connections, or like, what am I missing with the Jesus Dionysus thing?
I don't know. I don't know what I'm missing. I don't know what I'm missing either. It's not my idea. I'm riffing off the scholarship of this guy Dennis MacDonald. He wrote a very interesting book called The Dionysian Gospel. They're from the Claremont school. It's a really interesting comparison, and he's not the first. There are lots of German scholars who make this comparison between Jesus and Dionysus, which I think is a compelling one if you look at the Gospel of John. And there are lots of interesting clues in John that don't occur in the synoptics that are traceable to some elements of the Dionysian mysteries. Not that we know much about them either. I mean, much of this is scrapping at hints and clues, but I mean, things like the wedding at Cana, which was known in antiquity before Jesus, and the water to wine miracle, these things were known in antiquity and associated with the god of wine and theater and mystical rapture. The idea of the true vine only occurring in John. And then I spend a lot of time looking at the Greek of John's Eucharist, because I mean, I've been saying recently, it is impossible to understand the roots of Christianity without reading the Greek. I mean, the New Testament's written in Greek for a reason to Greek speakers. Paul's letters, more than half of the New Testament, are written to these communities who were trying to come to grips with this figure, right? And I think that without getting into too much detail, I think that John's using this imagery to speak to Greeks on their terms. And there's a lot of really graphic, evocative language. Like I talk about John, the 6th chapter of John a lot, when he uses this crazy language about this idea of munching on the flesh, of not eating the body of Christ, munching on the flesh of Christ, the only place where that occurs. And it is somewhat indicative of the graphic imagery that we see in the Dionysian mysteries in the literature of Euripides 500 years earlier. So where that gets us, I don't know. You're not missing any more than anybody else. I mean, we're looking at these linguistic clues over the course of 500 years and trying to draw parallels. A lot of it's just word games.
Sure. No, I agree with you wholeheartedly. Like when I was doing research for the Witches Ointment, like if you can't read Latin, you can't look into that topic at all. It's just, it's it's closed off to you. And so for a while it was closed off to me. I had to teach myself Latin to be able, to look at the sources. So I feel you on that. Bennett, you look like you had something to say.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm a little more open to the Dionysius thing. I did visit that territory in my 2010 book, Cannabis and the Soma Solution. I quoted the works of Harris writing in 1927, another scholar. Harris, like you, made a connection from Soma into Dionysius, as well as the connection to Ignatius and his food of immortality. But I think it's kind of on par with a lot of what can be said about Mithraic rituals and the imagery of cult meals there, and wine and bread being broken at tables and also underground, much like the mausoleum worship you're talking about in your book, The Immortality Key. And, lots of people have written about the Mithraic similarities to Christianity and as well, right? It brings up an interesting point. You must get this a lot, because every time I bring up fucking Jesus, I'm sorry, I swore. Every time I bring up Jesus, I have somebody going, well, Jesus didn't exist. Have you read Caesar's Messiah? And what's your view on that? Do you think that Jesus is a historical figure? I kind of see a historical figure overlaid with a lot of solar mythology and stuff like the wedding feast at Cana, added near the end there. And other solar mythology, the December 25th birth date and all that type of stuff that we know was developed later. But I do think that there's evidence of a historical figure at the base there. And I think the different Jesus of Gnosticism, who's much more like a Dionysiac type of figure than the dour figure that came down to us from the New Testament, a laughing Jesus that celebrates life. I think that there is something at the basis there, but it's not necessarily have to hold that that's true for a lot of what I write about.
Sure. So, yeah, just curious, Brian, you were, I believe, raised a good Catholic boy. I was raised a good Greek Orthodox boy. What is your take? Historical Jesus, yay or nay? Do you think there was a guy there or not?
I think I give a big yay after my 13 years of Catholic school. And also because, despite this, and this is probably what differentiates me from some folks who are fascinated by this stuff, is that I'm still a psychedelic virgin. And if anything, writing this book kind of emboldened my Christianity, for whatever that means. Mm-hmm. When I look back and I see this potentially psychedelic Eucharist and these crazy stories about a potentially Dionysian Jesus, I mean, to me, it's really interesting. And to me, it's the marriage of Catholicism and Orthodoxy and the Eastern and Western parts of what was the Greco-Roman world. I mean, for me, it's a much more rich and much more complex thing. I mean, I do think there was a historical figure. The way he's captured varies from gospel to gospel, mm-hmm. even within the canonical New Testament, and varies depending on which Gnostic literature you're looking at, or the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. I mean, there's so much there. It's all text. It's all relatively incomplete, which is why I'm excited about like the archaeochemistry. I mean, when there's a cannabis find in the Holy Land, it's something that should stop you in your tracks. And I just want to say, I mean, I love listening to Chris. I've never met anybody who knows as much about ancient cannabis as Chris, and I'm kicking myself for not, hanging out with him more often, because I probably could have buttressed some of my arguments better.
Oh yeah, it's a blast. I love being up in Vancouver. Bennett, we get together. We just roll joints and talk about psychedelic history. It's fantastic. But it's funny. Yeah.
Well, both of you come up for a visit to Soma Institute, man. You'll love it here where I'm at. It's like a 3-acre psychedelic retreat.
Yeah.
But Brian, now you wrote a lot about death and rebirth rituals in the Immortality Key, something again that I've also looked at. And it's interesting in these Zoroastrian accounts of the cannabis infusions, the individuals are knocked out for a couple of days in a starlight state, And there's other references to this happening, the whole Hashisheen story. They're knocked out and then they wake up in the Garden of Paradise. And in fact, the first 3 accounts in Europe of hashish, Arthur of Lubeck, Marco Polo, and the Decameron, they all describe the same knocked out state. And in fact, the first anesthesia was in fact a cannabis-infused wine in China. Now, in regards to death and rebirth rituals, infused wines, how do you think this relates to the resurrection of Lazarus and Jesus? And the whole basis of the Catholic Church is really this idea that Jesus resurrected after being crucified. And this is the basis of the religion, the crux which it stands on. And, you know, I don't know, are you familiar with the Passover plot by Dr. Hugh Schoenfield?
Yes. Yeah.
I don't.
It's go. It's treacherous territory for a good Catholic boy. You know, just I think I approach this a little bit. It's kind of nuanced. I mean, when it comes to the resurrection of Jesus, and when it comes to the Eucharist that was used at the Last Supper, Tom and his wonderful lineage would call it the mystical supper, which is a much better terminology, by the way. But I'm not sure what was happening there. I mean, we don't have the Holy Grail, and we don't have a lot of video cameras that were trained on the cross in 33 AD, give or take. So I don't know. But the way I approach the book, and my big thesis is, how would the earliest Christians have interpreted these things, right? What's interesting to me is that trance-like state that you talk about. I mean, so not everybody is going to physically resurrect after death. It's the hope in most Catholic and Orthodox young boys and girls. It's the hope after death, really, that Christianity is calling to. And yet there were initiates and there were ceremonies of entering these cataleptic trance-like states. So I didn't know about those references, but it's really interesting because I do focus a lot on that. And this comes up in Tom's research too, on witchcraft in the early modern period, this idea of falling down as dead and cold after using the Witches Ointment. It's a really interesting play on the Marseille ritual, which I write about a lot too, from the Canaanite and Ugaritic tradition. The idea of using these substances to die, I mean, maybe for a couple days at a time. It's like, it's a really fascinating part of the story for me.
Yeah, with
you know that a number of scholars in the 19th century suggested that the mirrored wine given to Jesus was specifically a cannabis-infused wine. This was both biblical and medical scholars in the 19th century at a couple of big conferences.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up with what Brian said, because you're absolutely right with these various lamiarum unguenta, as they were called, the witches' ointments. And one of the things that I don't think we can look past is that many of these women were saying that when they were in that other world, they were joining the trail of the dead. And in many cases, you couldn't, as part of, in at least some of the cases that I looked into, you couldn't enter this spirit world, this trail of the dead as a human. You either had to take on the likeness of a corpse or some kind of animal shape in order, you know, to enter this world. So I don't know, like the different animal shapes, like what they represent is kind of lost to us a little bit here and there. We have some ideas, but you know, I don't need to get into that right now. But the idea of the corpse, I think that that's really significant, especially when we're talking about these death rebirth rituals, which I think all three of us, if I'm not mistaken, would say that that's what Eleusis was. It was a kind of death rebirth ritual.
Sure.
Yeah. So the one of the other things I find that I was interested in, well, that I found very interesting because I wrote about this myself, was that I too believe that Osiris is an earlier form of Dionysus, as Brian, you write about in your book. But what do you think about Osiris actually being based off Dumuzi? I'm just curious about that, because I have my thoughts on it, and I kind of go back and forth about it. I was just curious if you had any, do you think that Dumuzi actually precedes Osiris?
That's a great question. I'm not sure if Osiris precedes Osiris. I mean, it's the further back in time we go, the shadier it gets. I mean, the Green Man, there's probably something that precedes both, and where he or she comes from, I'm not entirely sure. I'd prefer to be educated, Dr. Hatsis. Tell me.
Well, I'm not a doctor, but no, it's okay. I just because I know that you have a much better idea about, you know, those areas, like places that would use Sanskrit, for example, because you read Sanskrit, I don't. So that's why I was, that's, totally, out of my wheelhouse. And that's why I have my ideas, but I'm not 100% sure. Bennett, do you have any thoughts on that? Dumuzi as predating Osiris before becoming Dionysus?
Egypt is like, I can't really add to that. It's the loose. It's like my my understanding of the whole Aleutian mysteries is limited. I thought what you wrote about it was a little more solid. A lot of the ergot stuff, I don't know, I'm having trouble with, even like the stuff that Brian has in his book of wine, with that wine and the infusion. It's like in the skull and the wine. I can't see that. Maybe that could be contamination, contamination of ergot and stuff.
Do you mean the one in Catalonia?
Has anybody made? Yeah.
The one in Catalonia. Okay, well, Brian, so let's stay there. I'm not going to say my thoughts on it. I want to hear you elaborate, and then maybe
on ergot?
Say your thoughts on it first, so we can respond to both of us.
On the Catalonian Kukion, which I'm going to say Kukion now because I want to be cool.
Nah, I like it. Cool.
I want to be Kukion. That was horrible. That was bad. I'm so sorry.
That was bad, man.
Oh my God, I'm so sorry.
It's interesting. I think there's lots of different candidates for what the Kukion was, obviously. And there's lots and lots of places to take the investigation. For purposes of an elegant theory, and for purposes of following up on the 1978 book, The Road to Eleusis, I was trying to be a purist and follow what Albert Hofmann was writing about. And by the way, he himself changed his mind. In the 60s, he was collaborating with Carl Kerenyi, talking about the mint, right? He was speculating about the mint in the 60s. And in 1978, there's this ergot hypothesis, and just in deference to the man who synthesized LSD and knew a thing or two about ergot, I wanted to see if there was ergot to be found anywhere, and came across this crazy archaeobotanical find that was reported in Catalan and some Spanish, but just not widely reported. And I came across it after looking through Elisa Guerradose, this other archaeologist working in Spain. She referenced it, and I followed up on it and just diligenced the hell out of it, including going to the museum where this stuff is held to see it. And I grilled Enriqueta Pons, the archaeologist, and the archaeobotanist for like 2 years to see if there was a there. And they stand by their find from the 90s, and they stand by the concept of some kind of ergotized beer. Given just the archaeobotanical data. Now, Chris, to your point, how widespread this was, nobody knows. It's a blip on the radar. Was it unique to that sanctuary, that very Hellenic Greek sanctuary from the 2nd century BC? Maybe. Is it indicative of what was happening in Eleusis? It's not a crazy idea, but the purpose of this kind of investigation, which will take decades, really, is to see where the data falls on some of this botany and chemistry for me.
Sure. What I thought, if I could jump in.
I think you'd find a lot more continuity with cannabis. In that regard, I think you'd find a lot more continuity with evidence with cannabis in a very real way. But has anybody else commenting on that particular find said that that's just contamination? And how close in time periods was the wine residue and the jawbone? Like what time period? Are they in the same time frame, or are they like centuries apart, decades apart?
Yeah, same time period, same room, same sanctuary. Yeah. Jordi Treserras, the archaeobotanist, he wrestled with that. He wasn't going to publish it without asking those questions. So they found the remains of ergot in that tiny chalice. They found it in the human jawbone. Where they didn't find it was in the hand mill. And there was a mill for the preparing of bread and or beer inside that same sanctuary. He tested it. They didn't find any ergot there, which argues against the accidental hypothesis. And so it's worth considering the idea, especially given where it was found, a sanctuary, a domestic chapel. It's worth considering that this was a potion dedicated to the mysteries of Demeter and Persephone. It's really extraordinary.
Yeah. See, I actually like that because it bolsters my own theories that I wrote about in Psychedelic Mystery Traditions, was that and it's a point a friend of mine, Amanda, has also made, which is that we believe that in the very ancient world, the entheogen actually changed over time depending on time and place and availability. So whereas I've argued in my own work that opium was actually employed at Eleusis proper, I see no problem with them using ergot in Catalonia. You know what I'm saying? Like, nor would I find it odd if we discovered some Thracian rites to Demeter that used cannabis. I wouldn't find that odd at all. I think that they're all, I don't believe personally that the mystery surrounds the entheogen. I know I'm a little, I kind of step afield from most with that, but I think that the mystery was a much bigger thing than that. And that the entheogen just changed over time, depending on what was available and what they had. Such as to say that they might have used ergot edelucis at some point. They might have used mandrake edelucis at some point. You know, we really don't know, but we are finding these different, you know, references like the ergot beer, carvings of the Minoan poppy goddess, which is who I think Demeter is based off of, which is why I think they were using opium. But, you know, I don't know where I'm going with all this. But yeah, just to say.
I agree with that. You know, and I think I agree. I think that's true of Soma and stuff as well, you know, and that things change over time periods, access routes change, and replacements come in. And I don't think, you know, like a lot of times it's the ritual that confers the power on the substance. And also the tendency, if you don't have some, say, you don't have some good cannabis for something, let's add a bit of henbane, pinch of that. That still happens, you know, when they're making bong for holidays in India, stuff like that, adding additives to boost up the punch is still common. So lots of stuff like that for sure throughout it. You know what I mean? It is more the ritual and the context as much as the sacrament, and the sacrament did change. I can't argue with that.
Sure. Yeah. One of the things I also thought was funny, again, I loved your book, Brian. Your writing is just phenomenal, and also really funny at times. And one of the parts that I was just kind of, I found some kindred moments with you, because I too have been in archives and done archival work, and you have that moment where you're like, what the fuck am I doing here? Like, who let me into this place? But yeah, there's also that great moment, I believe, what is it, Adam Valenti, one of the first people you speak to, who was kind of laughs and says, well, I'm Greek. Everybody knows the ancient Greeks use these kinds of things. And I think that also speaks to a familiarity that can exist outside of scholarship that, you know, people just know about. And there has been this continuous knowledge of these plants and fungi. And I think that you do make a really good case for that. Again, I have my differences in the details, but the overall picture, I think it's a really important contribution. So
well, thank you, man. I think it is outside the recorded literature, obviously. I mean, I like spending time in archives to see what was written down and what was not. But it's not really about that if you think about it. I mean, the only reason I went into the archive of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, looking around, wondering what I'm doing there, looking at Inquisition documents, is to see if there was anything in the penmanship there from the 16th century to suggest that this sacred pharmacopoeia, which very much belonged in Western civilization, disappeared. And I mean, it seems that a lot of this folk medicine and folk legend and lore surrounding these magical plants, did largely disappear if you think about it. We have a very strange relationship with these plants today. The war on drugs is quickly coming to an end, but you know, I think there's the tendency to look elsewhere and exoticize the relationship with plants that other societies have. Ayahuasca being an example. I mean, I think part of writing this book and part of what you do and you, Chris, is that at the roots of Western civilization, this stuff is there. I mean, the Vatican can't take full credit for exterminating the sacred pharmacopoeia. I mean, part of this is just the generational loss of knowledge. But if you do look in the records, you see women being attacked for their knowledge of these plants. And you write wonderfully about it in the early modern period.
Oh, thank you. And now, yeah, and I wanted to bring Bennett into this because one of the areas that I think he has just done the most extraordinary research that I've read ever is with Liber 420 and the use of not just cannabis, although that's the focus, but other things, of course, like mandrake, henbane, deadly nightshade, did carry on in tradition in magical texts and grimoires and things like that. And I would love it, Chris, if you would just say a little something about that and, you know, what that was like.
Well, the foundational document the foundational document of the Western magical tradition is the 10th century Picatrix, or the 12th century Picatrix, which is a translation of the 10th century Gayat al-Hakim, and excuse me if I butcher the pronunciation on that. And it's full of drugs: mandrake, opium, hashish, incense, and it's, you know, Agrippa and all these guys, Paracelsus, they were all very familiar with this this document, which was very heretical as well, you know. And then in later magical grimoires, you know, I could point to 3 grimoires from the 16th century: the Cunning Man's Grimoire, Sefer Raziel, Liber Salomonis, the recently published Book of Oberon. And all of them have recipes with cannabis, opium, henbane, and these other substances, and cannabis particularly for seeing visions of the dead. And, you know, it's interesting, Sefer Liber Salomonis, which seems to be the origins of this in the ceremonial magic traditions, a Jewish document, and this fits very well with what was written about the holy anointing oil and ointments, and what was happening with ointments in Gnosticism as well, which I think, you know, maybe, as Brian was suggesting, a connection between Gnostics and witches. You know, we have the reversal of the religion in both Gnosticism and witchcraft, and the use of these psychoactive ointments for visionary purposes. You know, and there's other similarities as well, the circle dance and stuff like that, evidence of that in Gnostic texts like the Bruce Codex. And other things as well, you know. So there's some interesting connections there. I forgot what the question was, but I wanted to ask Brian, speaking of witchcraft, drugs, pharmacy, and stuff like that, are you at all worried about a Christian reaction to your work via the references to sorcery and revelation, which, you know, comes from the Greek word pharmakia and makes direct reference to the use of magical plants? And evangelicists like Hal Lindsley have long declared the rise of a drug cult in the latter days of the apocalypse. And I kind of liked it when you came on the scene, because I thought, well, do I really want literary success in my lifetime? Because it's going to get to that point where this whole issue of pharmakia comes up. And now I got a test pilot running the road ahead of me, the young warrior and Jedi Brian. And Brian, have you had any reaction on that?
No, it's been largely positive. I mean, I have to say,
I'm surprised.
When I get negative reviews, I will pass them directly to you. But I try and be very diplomatic about this, and I'm honest when I say it has enhanced my faith, and that I do look forward, in my own case, to experiencing psychedelics in a somewhat Catholic context, for whatever that means. I mean, in my case, trained by the Jesuits, I would envision a couple years of preparation and methodical work on these spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius, etc., preparing for that moment, not just with maybe medical personnel or the right guide or shaman, but maybe a priest or pastor or some member of the clergy. This idea of psychedelic chaplaincy is something that is being discussed at high levels. And you can look at Harvard Divinity School, where they're having conversations about psychedelics and the future of religion in a year-long series. I mean, this stuff is bubbling up and being discussed in serious ways. And I got to be honest, I talk to lots and lots of priests who are really intrigued with all of this and want to approach it as reverently and sacredly as we're talking about.
Sure. And I would just...
You know, I did think... Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, just that, and I appreciate the idea, Brian, you're saying that you want to do it like in a Jesuit style with like 2 years of preparation and things like that. I think that you don't even need to do it Jesuit style to have that preparation. I think everybody, no matter what discipline you're doing it, whether under a Catholic one as you do it, under a magical or Gnostic one like Chris does it, out of a dirty, witchy way like how I do it, there's still this preparation so that you can understand and couch the experience in something that makes sense. And one more thing I just want to say, this idea of the church, you know, picking up on psychedelia and becoming interested, that's not the first time that's happened. In the 1950s, the latter 1950s, there were several priests that were more than happy to give you a Catholic psychedelic experience. Like one of the people that's often talked about, Al Hubbard, you guys are both familiar with Captain Trips. One of the things that people don't bring up about him was how boisterously Catholic he was and how he ran Catholic sessions for people. He started, or not started, he joined, there was a Bible study group called the Sequoia Seminar up at Stanford, or just outside, in Palo Alto, where Stanford University is. And Al Hubbard joins them, and all of a sudden they become this psychedelic Bible study group. And it's like, so now you have people taking LSD and discussing the Bible. So it's like, hopefully we'll have an LSD Bible revival is what I'm trying to say.
I thought I was disturbed a little bit with your conclusion and also this. I'm not against that, but if it's limited to that, there's a real problem because we run into the situation with gatekeepers. And I think this is a repeat problem in the history of psychedelics in general, is this issue with gatekeepers, and we cannot have gatekeepers held back. Preparation is important. I would look more towards hermetic initiation in that regard. And one of the things I have on the roster for the future of Soma Institute is a 3-day initiation based on the marriage of the sun and the moon, which involves mushrooms, peyote, which is legal in Canada, and 5-MeO DMT, which is not illegal in Canada. Based on that, and then that you work through that, and there's a lot of interesting initiatory material in Masonic as well. In the early period of Masonry, there's this bitter cup, and myself and P.D. Newman as well have been suggesting that this was a psychoactive substance, and I think there's a lot of evidence of this, and this being a tradition going back through Rabelais, where we have cannabis references in his Gargantua Pantagruel, Franciscan monk, through the Masonic journal of 13th century Masonic journal of Villa de Harnecourt, and also through the Templars. Cannabis was seized at 2 simpler sites at their arrest, large amounts of cannabis, and they had Spaniards growing cannabis, Arabs growing cannabis for them in Spain, an area where we grow hashish, in an area at a time period when we know that hashish was in Spain. So I don't know where I was going with that, but lost myself again. Getting old.
I don't think, and Brian, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think Brian was talking about having this experience under the guidance of a priest as a gatekeeper thing. I think it was more of just a deep spiritual thing. No, but I don't want to speak for you.
It was more as a collaborative kind of arrangement. I mean, that said, I am also a lawyer, so I can't be advocating for the illegal use of substances. But what's happened in Oregon is a situation in which the first jurisdiction in the world where psilocybin for therapeutic purposes is being regulated as we speak and will be available in 2 years. I mean, so I'm trying to talk to the vast majority of the public for whom psychedelics are still kind of a question mark. And even if they're aware of the psychedelic renaissance and some of the clinical research, they're still taboo substances. And so, in 5 or 10 years, that's all going to change. And a place like Oregon is really going to be the model or template, like you see in cannabis states, for what might happen across the country, maybe around the world. So not gatekeeping, but I mean, setting up regulated licensed retreat centers is going to be one aspect of this. Another aspect is what's happening already, which is the Santo Daime. We already have psychedelic Christianity in Brazil. Is it possible that happens spontaneously in the United States, whether on the auspices of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act or otherwise? Absolutely. I mean, I feel like I enjoy this conversation when we're educating people about what's there instead of the war on drugs, which is not having the conversation. So I'm not out there advocating for it per se or setting up gates or anything. I'm just trying to talk openly about it.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate that. And I mean, the truth of the matter is, I get emails, I mean, not too often, but every now and then I'll get an email from somebody that is Catholic or Christian, some denomination, is it okay if I eat mushrooms, and will Jesus still love me and stuff? And it's like, I don't know really, no, and I mean this seriously, like, I don't know the best way to answer that, because the last thing I want to do is ruin anybody's faith or belief or anything by saying, oh yeah, go ahead, do it, doesn't matter, and then the kid has a bad time or something, you know what I mean? Like, it's hard because you don't want to gatekeep, but at the same time you do want to educate, like Brian said, and just let people know, like, hey, like, ayahuasca is not like going to a keg party.
Right.
I've done both, and they are two very different things. And if one of the ways I see it, because I am a spiritual person, like in a different discipline than Brian, but I am not an atheist in any way. One of the things I say to people is like, look, like, if you're on your way to a keg party and you pull your last cigarette out of your pack and throw it on the ground, like, yeah, you should probably look for a garbage, but nobody at the party, like, nothing's going to happen about that. Now, change that. You're on your way to an ayahuasca session and you throw that cigarette, like, wrapper or whatever box on the ground. She just saw that. And you're gonna be answering for that after you drink that ayahuasca. So it's, again, so I'm not saying to people don't drink ayahuasca. I'm just saying be very careful, because there are things out there that are picking up on what you're putting down, so to speak.
Wow.
I had a federal case for the freedom of religion for cannabis here in Canada. So I have fought for it, but I think it goes beyond a freedom of religion issue. And this is a natural right. It's like our right to air and water. It's life on earth, and humanity has an indigenous relationship with these plants. And I think that's the argument legally, is that there's this natural inherent right, and here's the proof of it. You know what I mean?
Well, sure.
And I've also run an Entheogen store for 19 years, recently shut down by Health Canada here in Canada, the Urban Shaman. And I provided the plants for making ayahuasca, peyote, other psychoactive cactus. And although I tried to live by no gatekeepers, I couldn't say that I always didn't gatekeep. And it was standard procedure at the Urban Shaman. If somebody said, is this going to mix with my medication? And it's like, look, man, we can't sell you this. Or somebody comes in and they're clearly emotionally disturbed. It's like, I don't believe this is going to help you, and I can't sell it to you in good conscience. And I'm sorry, and that's my choice, my will. My will's involved in this as well as yours. You know what I mean? And I'm not preventing you from going out in the world and trying to find other avenues to this place that I'm offering, right? But in the end, there is some responsibility there, and so there, I'm not. A free-for-all is going to lead to trouble. And we saw that in the 60s with LSD and what happened then. I think education is the key. And that anybody, maybe signing something that you understand what is written here, or showing somehow that you have knowledge of what this thing is that you're purchasing might be more of a standard kind of a gatekeeper. And that would be a gatekeeper that would be left to the individual to show that they have the right to this because they have the knowledge of what they're taking or something like that. But I don't know what that would look like.
Sure. Well, what we did in Oregon was we didn't just legalize for medical use. We also decriminalized the entire state. We decriminalized everything. Like in Oakland, they decriminalized specifically plant medicines. Here we we just got everything. So, there's people are going to have a choice is what I'm saying. If you want that, go to a clinic with a doctor experience. That's going to be available.
Yeah.
And if you're, more cavalier, you're at least not going to have your life ruined over enjoying your natural right. Because I think all three of us would agree that these are natural, this is a natural right for us to enjoy these substances.
Absolutely.
I wanted to talk a little bit also about love filters, because I know all three of us write about those, and also the Gnostic connection to all this stuff. And I mean, of course, Gnostic in a broad sense, in that, there were many different groups that fell under the umbrella term of Gnostic, and they didn't always get along either. But as far as what was it in a recent book, Brian? It was written that in the Gospel of Thomas, that Jesus says that he's going to measure out a drink. I wish I had the quote in front of me. damn it. Maybe I shouldn't go there then because I don't have it in front of me. No, because I don't want to get it wrong. So sorry, never mind. With this, the idea of Gnosticism, again in a broad sense, and the entheogenic experience, I personally think goes somewhat hand in hand, because it's about, with these different Gnostic sects, a lot of them, at least in the Nag Hammadi library, they talk about you're leaving your physical body behind. The flesh is evil, and you need to transcend that flesh to obtain gnosis. And I'm wondering, Brian, if you had something you wanted to add to that, because you wrote about it here. And
sure. I write somewhat about Gnosticism without focusing on it. As you know, I don't think you have to look much past the canonical New Testament to find hints and clues of that Dionysian Jesus, which is why I focus on the Gospel of John. But the second you're looking at the Gnostic literature, yeah, it's unavoidable. And again, the big question is, how widespread, which sacraments, when? I mean, I really resonate with the way you think about it. It was probably different sacraments at different places in different times. But if you look, I know you wrote about Marcus, the followers of Marcus, and I followed, and Ruck had written about that in the Apples of Apollo. So I was curious, and I finally took the time to read through the Greek of Hippolytus and the way he writes about those followers of Marcus. And I was shocked to see the word pharmakon 7 times in a row in the Greek, which I circled with a big red pen. That to me is the strongest literary evidence for a psychedelic sacrament in early Christianity, in Gnosticism, I've ever seen.
I agree, but I would also point to 1 Corinthians. I know Bennett, you were about to say something. We'll get back to 1 Corinthians, but Bennett, what were you about to say?
I wrote about lots of Gnostic references, including that reference in Marcus, which is very good. And people have been suggesting psychoactives since that. I think Salverte first suggested it around 1875 and went into great detail about it being a psychoactive substance. I discussed
I would say it goes even earlier. I'd say it goes all the way back to the Church Fathers. I'd say
they basically accuse him of it. No, for sure. But I mean, like comparing to the use of actual what we know as drugs and psychoactives at that time, which were prevalent in magic. I think probably one of the best examples is the Bruce Codex, which I sent you both yesterday with Greek translations. This is a Gnostic text outside of the Nag Hammadi, procured by a Freemason, James Bruce, in the 18th century, and it has the books of Jew and the second book of Jew. In there's a wine miracle parallel with the Cana wine thing, and also incenses that contain a wonder. They refer to burning juniper branches, betel, other substances, rituals involving vine branches and wine, which seem to be some sort of infusion ritual, and involving men and women. And Jesus is leading these ceremonies, So I think that's the best. Another a good example is Zosimos. He says, after his visionary journey, I did not take it again. After my experience, I did not take it again, which I kind of think is indication that he took something and was like, whoa, that was a little too crazy. There's references as well to Indian leaves in Gnostic texts, plant of kindness used for healing stubborn limbs. And, the role of the anointing oil in John and in the Nag Hammadi texts and elsewhere is pretty prevalent. It says, I believe it said John in the Synoptic Gospel, that says he who's had the anointing requires no teacher. That's pretty blatant, that the substance itself contains information. And Gnostic scholars like Kurt Rudolph have written about the basic point of contention between what became the Catholic Church and Gnosticism, being water baptism versus the anointing with oil. And Gnostics say specifically that there is only water in the baptism, but the anointing oil contains fire, and through it we are initiated in unfading bliss, and refer to its medical healing properties as well, the straightener of crooked limbs and things like that. And I do suggest that it's probably more powerful than just the cannabosum of Exodus 30:23, and by this time there's indications of mandrake. And I think what you presented in the Western mystery traditions as well indicates the inclusion of other substances and anointing oils and wines in the early Christian period, Tom.
Yeah, I think also we can get right down to JC himself, Jesus, actually using some of these things. Now, I too think that there was a guy there It's funny, Brian, before you had said that after your tenure in Catholic school, you couldn't help but think there was, a historical Jesus. I went to Catholic school and Sunday school, but it was only after studying history that I was like, no, I think there was a guy there.
That's great.
Yeah, it was more like my argument, because I'm not a Christian. I don't have anything against Christians or anything. I don't have anything against anybody. But like when I say that I think there was a guy there, I'm saying that as a historian, not as an actual believer in the faith. So one of the things that I found interesting, which is the point I'm trying to get at, is that Gospel of John, I believe, does record that there were certain miracles that Jesus performed that we didn't write down here. I believe that's actually in John's Gospel. And one of the things that I speculate on in mystery traditions is that, so one of Jesus's specialties was casting out demons. And when you look at the ancient world, the way you cast out demons was by giving somebody mandrake. That's what Josephus says. There's a story about Solomon who he kept mandrake in his ring to expel demons. So when Jesus is using these different anointing oils or sending his disciples out with them, you could argue that it was a cannabis ointment, and I think that Chris does, but you could also argue that it was a mandrake ointment, and in that sense, you could argue that there's a familiarity there, again, going back to Brian's point that, there was more of a sophistication in the ancient world with these concoctions than we sometimes give credit for. I mean, Jesus and his followers could have very well been using mandrake, cannabis and opium and all kinds of other things.
I think that
on that point, I want to point out there's Assyrian references to cannabis, cannabu, for dispelling hand of ghosts, which is thought to be epilepsy. Epilepsy was thought to be demonic possession, and Paracelsus has actually a arcanum, an infusion of cannabis into wine with cannabis and other substances that was used for epilepsy in his own lifetime.
Sure.
So, and now we see the miracle of cannabis with epilepsy, which is a miracle for these parents that are seeing their children relieved of epileptic seizures. This is real science. It's not like speculation here, but a combination as well, right? Like that's what I think, hey, this works, that works, and they're certainly mixing them in wine. Why not mixing it in infusions of holy oil as well?
Sure. Brian, you were about to say something as well?
I think it's really cool. I mean, I wish I had more time in the book to write about the Greek magical papyri, but clearly there's an herbal knowledge there. I mean, how could there not be? And I almost immediately think of Morton Smith and the Secret Gospel of Mark and Jesus the Magician. I mean, there's so much rich material there, even in the Secret Gospel. I mean, given despite the questions of its provenance and authenticity.
What's your thought on that?
And I know the honest answer is I don't know. I mean,
I don't know either. But what is your guess about it?
My inkling is that I don't think Morton Smith fabricated the document.
Okay.
You're talking about I think it was like a 17th century edition of Ignatius of Antioch, written seemingly in 18th century Greek. It's such a weird document, and the find is so strange.
Yeah.
I don't see who could have forged that. It's just and the way it was stuffed into the back of that codex, I don't think it was invented. Okay. I'm not sure what to make of it. I don't think it was invented.
Okay, I did want to add though, because you brought up.
I love that book.
You brought up the Greek magical papyrus. There's also the Demotic magical papyrus. I write about both of them in Psychedelic Mystery Tradition. I mean, they talk about using opium and magical spells. In one of them, I believe, actually calls for using 3 grams of opium or 3.5 grams of opium in one spell and inside. That's a lot of opium. Like that is, you are going to be really, 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 in a magical state of mind after that. But I'm sorry, Chris, you were about to say something. Apologies for jumping in.
Oh, I was just saying, I love that book by Morton Smith, Jesus the Magician.
Oh, yeah.
And he suggests in that Lazarus' resurrection was a mystery school initiation, which fits with a lot of what Brian was saying about death and rebirth cults, and that's what I suggested of it when I wrote Sex, Drugs, Violence in the Bible.
Yeah, he also writes that the transubstantiation scene actually is reminiscent of, and I quote, hallucinatory rites. I would actually recommend anybody out there, Morton Smith, Jesus the Magician. It's phenomenal. It's fantastic.
Agreed. Yeah, in one of the editions of the Secret Gospel of Mark, he also writes in English. This is Morton Smith writing. He says he talks about an influence from both the Greek and the Jewish magical practices, whereby the disciples participate by hallucination in the ascent to the heavens. This Kabbalistic literature of the magical ascent. I mean, it's just really profound stuff.
Sure, absolutely. And do you, as somebody, again, who thinks there was a historical Jesus, Brian, do you think that he was practicing what could be considered a form of magic, or do you don't want to step over that heretical line just yet?
I might not go quite as far as Morton Smith, maybe in a couple of years. But for the way I see it, he was certainly a healer. I mean, I do like the way Ruck deconstructs the etymology of Jesus to come up with the drug man, which I find very, very entertaining. This idea of being based on eos, the Greek for drug or poison, which does essentially make Jesus the drug man. Even more interesting for me is that to a Greek ear, Yeso would have reminded them of the Greek goddess of healing, which was Yaso or Yeso. I mean, so there's clearly a healing tradition there.
Mm-hmm.
Well, wasn't that a common name back then, though? Like, Jesus wasn't the only Jesus walking around.
Yeah, Yeshua was a pretty... Yeshua, right, is how you would say it. It's kind of like Mary in the ancient world. That everybody's Mary. That all the guys have these various names, but all the women are just Mary. Mary of Bethany, Mary Mother of Jesus, Mary Magdalene. You know what I mean? No, but this is the thing though. So when people talk about the historicity of the Gospels, that's why I think that there's some history, like real history there. And it's an odd point to make, but it's like, well, if you were making it all up, the women would have different names because it gets kind of confusing after a while. Like, which Mary are you talking about? If you're making it all up, there'd be Mary, Sarah, and like Jolene or whatever, but just one of those things.
That's a really interesting point. It's pretty shitty writing otherwise.
Yeah, it's just, unless you were saying, well, why did you call her Mary, the mother of Jesus, Mary Magdalene, and Mary from Bethany? It's like, well, because all three of them were named Mary. That's why.
That's interesting, Tom. That's
really I have these odd ways of going about biblical exegesis. But yeah. Wow. So what haven't we talked about yet? Let's go. So I don't want to box Chris. I don't want to be a gatekeeper because I know Chris hasn't really written extensively about Eleusis, so I'm kind of hesitating to go there. But would that be, Chris, do you have thoughts on Eleusis? I know it's not one of your main...
Yeah, no, it's not one of my strong points. I've written a little bit about Greek use. I got chapters on it in my books, and I made a little documentary with Rock and Hillman and stuff. And I think Asterion. That I'd like to see more stuff on Asterion, this star herb, as it appears in Greek literature and references to it being cannabis, because I think that hasn't really been followed up. I think the problem with a lot of this stuff, like when I was writing Liber 420, for instance, a lot of this alchemical Latin material that I'd found, I'd only found because the cannabis is spelled the same, or variations of in Latin. And Google Books has scanned all these 16th, 17th century texts into their database, and then I was finding references to cannabis, and then being able to roughly get some idea of the context and checking out who the authors were, and then getting it translated. And then I found alchemical recipes and other things. And I think the same is going to hold true for the wealth of Greek material that hasn't really been thoroughly gone through. We got people like David Hillman have done some stuff, but I find Hillman is really not clear on direct references of where the material that he's interpreting is coming from, and what the actual Greek text says verbatim, and he makes some generalizations and assumptions. So I'm not convinced there. Greek is probably the weak area because of the lack of actual cannabis references as opposed to, or known cannabis references as opposed to a lot of other areas of history. But go ahead and discuss it. If I have something to say, I'll kick in. We got lots of time.
Okay, or sure, or we could just go somewhere else, with this. I mean, we're talking about psychedelics in the ancient world, which I mean is pretty abundant.
Yeah,
And,
I didn't see the connection between soma and eleusis that Brian suggested, and I don't think ergot's a very strong candidate for soma. There's the whole 10th mandala is a clear dedicated to the descriptions of the plant soma, and it's certainly not making it barley. Elsewhere in the text, there's direct references to the plant soma. So, clearly the soma itself was something else. And I'm surprised Brian didn't at all mention the Mazdian Zoroastrian Haoma, because there's much more of a direct connection to Greek influence there than from India and the Soma. The Greeks were in contact with Zoroastrians, well aware of it, just like they were in contact with the Scythians. And well aware of these.
You got to pick and choose, as you know. Well, Chris, you write mammoth books. I pick and choose.
Yeah. I got OCD or something.
Yeah. Well, so real quick, Soma is very much out of my wheelhouse. So, Brian, if you want to, if you guys want to discuss that real quick, I don't have anything. Chris knows it is one of my blind spots in psychedelic history. I don't know anything about Soma, but Brian, if you want to pick up then on that, what is the best piece of evidence for the connection between the Soma and the Kukian?
The most compelling, some of the most compelling, outside the actual Vedas, that I've read is Calvert Watkins, who I mentioned in the book. This book, there's an article, Let Us Now Praise Famous Grains. This idea of what we know about Soma, and this was what I was trying to explain on the Rogan show. What we know about it is that it was a mixed beverage. And I think that's the most comfortable I am talking about it, is a mixed beverage. It's mixed with different things and likened to different things. I do agree it is described as a plant in Sanskrit. It's hard to avoid that. I don't think ergot is involved at all. I'm not even sure if Soma is psychedelic. What I do know is that it's a mixed beverage, sometimes with milk, sometimes with honey, sometimes with other things that are mentioned in the Vedas. I would love to see some really cutting edge work done on the botany and the chemistry, and looking at eco-paleological maps to see what was actually growing in the subcontinent, and make a more educated guess. I only referenced a couple papers that have come up, and they're from the 1970s for a reason, because I don't think there's a lot of good botany happening. I've read Sarianides' work. I don't think that was confirmed under later conditions to have actually been cannabis or opium, or what I've read in the papers. There were some Dutch scientists who he sent samples. Again, we don't know what happens, not to say that Sarianides was wrong, but what attracts me to this whole conversation are things that are observable, testable, repeatable, and falsifiable. And so the better data we have on that, I think the closer we're going to get to that Soma solution, which is not to say it wasn't cannabis. It's a great hypothesis worth investigating.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I disagree. I think the archaeology's in, and there's a lot of evidence for the case. And it's going to take me 5 minutes to go over this.
That was as diplomatic an answer as you can hope for.
Indo-European. We have the Indo-European use of cannabis, which is well known. The term itself is Proto-Indo-European, Finno-Ugaric, so we know that they were well familiar with it. In fact, the oldest evidence point to is in the Ukraine region. Andrew Charette points to polypod bowls with evidence of burnt cannabis with seeds of cannabis from 5,500 years ago. That's 3,500 years ago. This is amongst the people that were the domesticators of the horse, which is also thought to have developed through the development of ropes made of hemp fibers, allowed for the development of the horse. There's whole theories on that as well. And this led to the widespread spreading out of cannabis throughout the ancient world to romantic figures like the Scythians. And one of the names of the Scythians I'd like to point out is Haoma Varga, those who gathered Haoma. And they also were accused of burning Haoma, and we know they burnt cannabis and drank cannabis from archaeological evidence. Then we have the situation in China with the Gushi culture, Indo-European culture. We have evidence of ritual use of cannabis in funerary rituals, burnt in a similar manner of Scythian style, bouquets of flowers left on things, prepared female cannabis, And a quality cannabis, we're not talking like fiber hemp here. We know the Gushi people through the Silk Route. This has changed the whole concept of how old the Silk Road was. It used to be thought about 100 BC. The Gushi were in China, central China, the Tian Shan Mountains, from about 2000 BC to 400 BC when they were chased out by the Han Chinese. And then the influence on Taoism, where cannabis is known as a plant of immortality and appears in immortality elixirs, is thought to have developed from the interaction with the Gushi culture. We know the Gushi were in trade with a extensive trade route because of artifacts found in China and found at the Scythian site, the Bemak site of Syrian, where he claimed cannabis, ephedra, and opium poppy. And then we have the evidence of the Scythians, which travel between the Indo-European brothers out in China and the other things in their extensive trade routes known as the Helmabarga, of gold goblets, preparations that contained residues confirmed of cannabis and opium. And the Russian archaeologists that suggested that this was a preparation of Helma. And cannabis wasn't grown on the subcontinent originally, it was imported. And a lot of the problems that led to its prohibition had to do with the importation and the quality of soma that was arriving in India. Later, indigenous Indian cannabis growing and stuff like that did take place on a larger scale. But the initial thing was importing. And then we have this Patatha brahmana, which refers to the plant specifically used for making soma, usana. Sana is a Sanskrit term for cannabis. U is this unknown prefix, and that is the thing that stands between the confirmation. But it seems from the textual references in the Patatha brahmana that the sana was a reference to textile hemp, and the usana was a reference to resin cannabis. Remains, it really needs like Sanskrit scholars and stuff like that to go over a lot of this. But when it comes to Indian scholars, you'll find that the vast majority, and I cite a wide number of Indian scholars in this regard, have seen cannabis as the most likely candidate for soma.
Well, there you have it. Several thousand years of evidence for soma in 3 minutes.
That's pretty good. That's pretty good.
No, that's excellent. That's excellent.
Stop this!
So I wanted to bring it back to actually one of my favorite parts of your book, Brian, which is when you talk about not the agricultural revolution, but the beer revolution. And you wrote something that I absolutely loved, which was, I'm paraphrasing here because I read this a few days ago, but it's something along the lines of, civilization did not fuel out beer. Beer was actually the engine behind civilization. And I'm wondering, just to perhaps entice people to buy your book based on one of my favorite arguments you've made, if you wouldn't mind elaborating on that a little bit, and then we can all, we could talk about it, because it was just, okay. I loved it. I thought it was great. Thanks, man. Again, not one of my ideas. There's very little originality here. It's an old debate from the 1950s between J.D. Sauer and Robert Braidwood, the beer versus bread debate. And the idea being, which was humanity's first biotechnology? If you think about it, why did we go from hunting and gathering to settled agriculture? We really don't have the answer. Jarrett Diamond refers to that moment 12,000 years ago in the Epipaleolithic as the worst mistake in the history of the human species. As cavemen, we were tall, happy, healthy, and resilient. We move into these settled conditions near our livestock, infectious diseases running amok. We're leading worse lives, and our diet is reduced to just a few starchy crops. Why would you do that? Again, another one of the big whys that we don't have. We don't know what spurned the agricultural revolution, which I speculate could be the beer revolution, based on this old really fun debate. And I flew all the way to Munich, Germany to talk to Martin Zarnkow about this. And he supports the idea of the beer revolution for a really simple reason, which I didn't know. I love beer, and I probably drink at least one beer a day. And what I didn't know is that in prehistory, it's really easy to brew beer. In fact, it's easier than baking bread. And the way Zarnkow explained it to me, which may be interesting for you, is that to brew beer, you take the crop, you rip it out, and you throw it in water. And that's brewing beer. So without yeast, that will ferment because of the microbiome on your hand, which I found totally fascinating. And you don't need heat, you don't need to boil it, you don't need to crush it.
the way you would for bread dough. I mean, so just in the abstract, it's really interesting to think that beer was a sacrament and that we settle down to consume this sacrament. And Zarnkow also found the initial traces of calcium oxalate on these giant troughs and barrels at Göbekli Tepe, thousands and thousands of years before the high civilization. So it's a really cool story. There's more science to be done. And I think a new article might be coming out about that next month.
Yeah, I see that. I think I'm on your side of the fence with all that. I think that it was something more beer-like, again, just because of how simple it is. And just there's that certain, I mean, it would have seemed miraculous to people. It would have seemed like magic. Because again, they don't know about microbiomes on their hands. They know nothing about this stuff. So it's just like how this is happening. And I think that that actually gets to the core of what all of these different various ancient mysteries were about. I see them more as explanations than as questions. You know, explanations at a time when people, they didn't know why the sun rose and, set. They didn't know why it rained. They didn't know a lot of these things. They didn't know why we dreamed. I mean, we still kind of don't know why we dream. But Bennett, what's your thoughts? Bread or beer? What came first, the bread or the beer?
Oh, I think cannabis is the first agricultural crop, and this is something that Sagan. Yeah, McKenna.
Wait,
and if you take a look at the archaeological evidence again. 28,000 years ago, tools for use for decording hemp. 24,000 years ago, hemp rope. 10,000 years ago, cattle hyoc, and Taiwan hemp fiber. So we've already got this long history. And then this brings us to Andrew Sherratt's theory about corded ware culture, which was pervasive throughout all of Europe. And Andrew Sherratt, and this is also suggested in the Encyclopedia of Indo-European Studies, who say there's been 3 major waves of cannabis, both for intoxicant and fiber, through pre-Common Era Europe, going back 5,000 years. And this idea is of Sherratt's is that corded ware culture found all over the place, Eurasia, Europe, is evidence of a cannabis-based drink, and corded ware traced into cannabis. And even McGovern says that he suggests that cannabis was a crop before hops. That's Pat McGovern in his book.
So, but
McGovern also sees Serenetti's theory as well.
But sure, but do you like going back to, you mentioned cattle hyoc? Was there any evidence of beers there, Brian? Of these?
Oh no, just fiber. I don't know about beer.
So I
don't know about bread versus beer. I thought we were talking agriculture. I was thinking more on the agricultural level. That agricultural starts for one.
No, but what my question is more, so let's call it cannabis beer. Let's just say for argument's sake, there was a cannabis beer. My question is more.
No, it could be beer. I think a lot of beer and wine was preserving something to drink.
Yeah.
Because everything you can count on pond water, and this is a major source, even like in the Bible, new wine, stuff like that. You needed stuff to drink. You couldn't trust every stream and source of fresh water.
Sure, yeah. Brian, you write about that, how, I mean, the alcohol, again, because it was such a lot of things, like 14%, that was the extent of the content. I think there's a point that, again, all 3 of us have brought up in our published works, that there has to be something else going on with the descriptions that you get of what's happening when people drink these wines and beers versus knowing that they couldn't brew anything beyond 14%. There's a disconnect, and that's why I agree with you, Brian, that in those days, the beer, and I believe, Benny, you're saying the same thing, the beers and the wines were there more as delivery systems, no?
Yeah.
If you could take it away, Brian, if you wouldn't mind on that.
I mean, at least in terms of the sacred pharmacology, I think there was probably ordinary light Budweiser. There was probably your everyday table wine, the way you find today. But I mean, when you look at the literature of Dioscorides, for example, in the 1st century AD. And when you look at the science, and I cite a couple different finds, one from Egypt at Abydos and the other from Tel Kavri, where my colleague Andrew Coe found the world's oldest wine cellar. It's really impressive. What you find time and again are wines that were spiked with all kinds of things. In the case of Tel Kavri, not psychedelics per se, but I mean, you know, we're just finding the bits of data here. Yeah, exactly. That one was spiked with like honey and storax and terebinth and cypress and cedar, etc. Some of it is to preserve the wine. Some of it is to balance palatability, you know, with aromatics and things like that. And some of it is for psychotropic infusions. I mean, and I think that the same holds true with beer. These were delivery systems when needed. And McGovern refers to them as the universal palliatives. I mean, this is how you took your medicine. It wasn't with a glass of water. It was with a glass of beer or wine.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I wanted to
Have you seen those references from Zosimos? Have you seen those references from Zosimos about beers and wines and cannabis and Darnell and that type of stuff?
I translated it for
you. Yes, sir.
Well, I know you translated it.
Yeah, you have, Brian?
I have. And I will include them in my next encyclopedia.
Yeah. Yeah, no, awesome. One of the things that I wanted to ask that I don't see it brought up enough, I guess, in psychedelic literature, especially psychedelic historical literature, and that's how much set and setting played into this stuff, and how, you know, there's how can I put this? Like when I'm writing, and let's say I'm just like, I have a regular IPA, you know, and I'm writing a book or whatever, article, whatever, and I have that IPA, right? I am in a different mindset than if I'm at a club dancing, drinking an IPA. And this is just a beer, but take the IPA out of this situation and my brain is in a completely different place. And now you add, you know, the sacrament on top of it. I think that that's something that gets a little overlooked. Like I was once asked if I could just go into this real quick, because again, I think that the entheogen at Eleusis was actually opium, and I think that opium was very rampant in ancient Greece. Brian, you're probably familiar with the town of Macon in Greece. Opium village was what it translates. Yeah, opium village. So they were very familiar with this, and it's like, well, then how were they wondering what was in the Kukion if they knew about opium? It's like, well, there's a completely different set and setting happening as well in the background, and that's again going back to your point with as a Jesuit, you'd want to study for 2 years, you know, just like they were doing with the lesser mysteries going into the greater mysteries. There's this time of education beforehand that I just think is so necessary. Or in magical books, like what Chris writes about, a lot of these, you know, sorcerer apprentice kind of situations is exactly that. There's an apprentice there learning how to do this. Like a great example would be Johann Wehr apprenticing under Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa von Nettesheim, the most famous Renaissance magician, you know, of the 1500s. So, what are your, if you don't mind, in either
regards to setting.
What's that? Yeah.
In regards to set and setting, you know, I think it's important to remember that things like ventriloquism, sleight of hand, these were originally shamanic tricks, and it had to do with building people's own belief. And I think that's kind of an important point with Jesus the magician. You know, we know a hero of Alexandria in the 1st century created a device that would make water turn into wine with a series of siphons, and he'd pour it in and then he'd pour out water, you know. So the idea that these types of things could have well been used in combination with psychoactive substances. Another important factor is music. And I don't think we can underplay the fact that a lot of this stuff is lyrical. And, you know, I really think that everybody should read Julian Jaynes' The Origins of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind, and the role the right plane brings in through this sort of patterning aspect of music. And this is true of a lot of Jewish literature, the Vedas, a lot of this Greek stuff. And it's like the combination of drugs and this certain beat, and you get thrown in a rhythm. And we see this today with rappers, man. They get in the jive, they smoke a blunt, they hear a beat, bump, bump, bump. And then the words start kind of repeating and coming out in kind of a jangle. That's a different kind of aspect of our regular conscious, which is probably coming up from the unconscious or subconscious.
Sure, absolutely. Brian, set and setting in ancient mysteries?
I think, yeah, we're trying to triangulate setting, and substance, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's funny, I spent a whole book looking for the elusive substance, but the real story is set and setting. And part of the reason I wrote this is because of this, what's happening today, and helping to educate, whatever that means. But, the set and setting, I think, is critical, if not determinative, of what happens here. Like if you think about the Hopkins experiments, there is soothing music being pumped in the entire time. I mean, there's a 5-6 hour playlist there. That's important. The sense of trust that you have with the guides. There's a screening process that happens at Hopkins and NYU to help guide these people through it, integration afterwards. I mean, when you look at Eleusis, it's the one thing that kind of jumps out at you. And why I started down this weird path 12 years ago when I started reading the Hopkins literature, the first thing I thought about was Eleusis. You're talking about a once in a lifetime experience, basically, typically later in life, something you prepared for, at least 6 months, maybe 18 months, maybe longer. In the case of Eleusis, where there was a mystagogue, a guide, taking you through it, where there were things that were said, the legomena, there were things that were shown, the pneumena, things that were done, the dromena. But at the end of it, there was this engineered process to turn human beings into immortals. I think there are lessons there for today, because I think we're going to move past a therapeutic model into this, whatever's going to happen in Oregon, like you say, Tom. It's not just going to be in these regulated retreat centers. It's not just going to be in the underground. Something's going to happen there where I think the more information we have about the mysteries, how incredibly relevant all of a sudden in the 21st century, a bunch of dead languages. There's information here.
Yeah, no, totally, absolutely.
Never been a time like this where you have access to so much information. You know what I mean? You could get like 10 different translation of the Vedas or Greek literature and anything like that, original documents right at your fingertips. And that's why I don't think we can compare our work to the work of pre-internet scholars, because there's no way they could have done the sort of research that we're able to do at the touch of our fingers.
Oh, absolutely. Something else, if I could just move into a different direction very briefly, because there's not much to say about it, but it's something I did want to bring up. We talk about things like cannabis, opium, henbane, mandrake, mushrooms, things like that people are using in the ancient world, ergot. We sometimes overlook, though, all of these other plant and perhaps fungal descriptions of things that we don't know what they were. Like, we don't know what people were talking about. Like when Pliny writes about Thasango, I believe it's called, this magical plant that allows Persian mystics to prophecy, we have no idea what he's talking about. When ancient authors talk about hippomanes as this psychoact, they always speak about it in these psychoactive terms, and it's like, we don't know what that was. Brian, you write about Ivy, of course, in your book with the Dionysius connections and stuff, but one of the things that I also pointed out is that there might, in psychedelic mystery traditions, is that there might have been in the ancient world a kind of psychedelic or entheogenic ivy that is just, it was either over harvested or it went extinct or something, because the descriptions, like especially Plutarch, when Plutarch talks about the Maenads eating the ivy causing a wineless drunkenness.
Yeah.
Like, what could that possibly be other than something psychoactive?
Yeah, I agree. And Dioscorides, he says, tarasusitin dianoian, it deranges the senses. I mean, what kind of ivy is this? I quote Andrew Coe in the book, who says that despite all this literature and all the stuff that we like to look at, whether it's in the Akkadian or the Hittite or the Elamite or the Greek or the Hebrew or whatever, we've only identified, we think, about 20% of the species. I mean, everything we know about plants today, this is all post-Linnaeus and this binomial classification that we have today. Frankly, I think it's fair to say we have very little idea what the ancients were talking about with these plants. There's a way to try and rediscover that, and I'm having conversations with different universities about different projects to do that. But I mean, the point being, there's really rich territory there. There's 80% of the pharmacopoeia to try and unlock. And what if we do manage to resurrect one of these lost species? It's really fascinating.
Yeah, and there's also Danny Nemu brought up in an article that came out last year in the Journal of Psychedelic Studies that there's also a lot of combinations of things, especially in the Old Testament. And Bennett, you'll probably be able to comment on this a little bit, that they're totally innocuous by themselves, but when you put them together, you actually get a psychoactive effect. Again, that's outside of my area. I don't know much about, the Old Testament stuff and psychoactives other than cannabis. But Bennett, I was wondering, as you finish rolling that joint of cannabis.
Well, not something I write about a lot. It's not something I write about a lot, but there's the suggestion that acacia was used in combination with Syrian root. Acacia was certainly used as a wood for the Ark of the Covenant. I have yet to see any sort of direct reference indicating the combination. I thought a lot of what Flattery and Schwartz presented about Syrian root and the Mandeans, though, was kind of interesting. In their book, Heoma and Harmaline, although I didn't agree with their identification of Heoma and their etymology of Bong, I thought there was a lot of really good research in there, particularly regarding one of the only surviving Gnostic texts, the Sabians or Mandeans, worshippers of John the Baptist. And there's certainly references to psychoactive plants in the Mandean literature, and they have been depicted as drug users, cannabis, by Gerard de Nerval and other authors a century ago. Yeah, I don't know. It's like the manna stuff. I'm not convinced. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah,
this manna is a mushroom, a psilocybin mushroom, or this acacia. I brought Benny Shannon out. I heard his shtick about the burning bush being acacia and stuff like that. I don't particularly buy it. I guess what I like about the Cannabis was the such stronger linguistic evidence with Assyria and the archaeology now. You know what I mean? It's not a question anymore.
Yeah, but the thing with the burning bush,
but I don't doubt they used whatever they could find.
The thing
these people had huge experience with herbs.
The thing with the burning bush is that it's not impossible. Like, one of the things that I try to separate, in the past is like, well, is this could this have had of course we don't know if what the burning bush was, but it's not improbable that it was some kind of psychoactive bush that caught fire and caused these kinds of reactions. It's not impossible. So, Brian,
it's like the Garden of Eden and the Tree of Knowledge.
Well, there.
Is it real or is it just something they've incorporated?
Is it what? Sorry, miss.
Is it real or is it just something they've incorporated into the story? You know what I mean? It's like when I wrote my book on the Bible, I kind of took Moses as a historical figure. But by the time I wrote my book on Soma, I kind of think that Moses may well be an invention. It could have all started with Ezra, He returns after a vassal of the Zoroastrians and brings monotheism to canon. And, we know from archaeological evidence that it was mostly polytheistic through the whole period. And I think this is interesting in regards to what Brian says about women. If you follow these references to Cannabis, and the archaeology out of Arad fits with this, it's the use of the cannabis in the cult of Asherah, the queen of heaven, who was one-time wife of Yahweh. We have archaeological inscriptions testifying Yahweh and his partner, fucking Asherah, It's pretty clear that at one time God had a wife. And imagine, you talk about the suppression of drugs and women in the story of Jeremiah. This is where all this cannabis stuff ends, and it's clearly about the woman burning incense to the queen of heaven and pouring out drink offerings to her. And he says quite specifically about canna, what do I care from your canna from a distant land? Your sacrifices do not appease me. All of a sudden what was in favor is now out of favor, and the religion goes from a shamanic to a laws and conduct, and the suppression of women is complete, and what a crime of the fucking history is the downplaying of the sacred feminine is the biggest crime in human history.
Yeah, I think we've all pretty much agree on that. We've all written about that in our own ways. Truth be told. One of the other things, sorry, and I wanted to bring this up before, and I totally forgot. Not just the things I was talking about, different entheogens and psychoactives that we don't know what they were talking about, and then there's the kinds of things where we do know what they were talking about, but like frankincense, which is something that Bennett has written about, and I've also joined, because there are people like Tatian in his address to the Greeks, where he says that women lose their minds to the smell of incense, which again to me suggests something psychoactive. Dioscorus says the same thing. Dioscorus says that mandrake is the most popular or the most widely used psychoactive in love filters. I think that that's something that cannot be, just overlooked so easily. With I keep wanting to bring it back to Eleusis. Brian, just real quick, and I won't say it. What do you think the Narcissus was that Persephone plucks? Do you have any thoughts on that?
From the hymn to Demeter?
Yeah, exactly.
The 100-headed Narcissus.
The 100-headed Narcissus.
I mean, I reserve the right to change my mind, but given that it was it's cognate with narcotic, I think it might just be a cipher. It might not be pointing to anything in particular. I think it's pointing to a cipher, which is to say that it was some kind of enchantment, right?
Sure.
There's some kind of connection with the earth. I don't have a particular species in mind, but again, just in English, that word jumps off the page and is saying there's drug lore here.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, okay. Just wondering on that. One of the things that I also think we need to kind of recognize is the variety of different kinds of psychoactive and mystery experiences that existed in history. I know both of you, Chris and Brian, you see a lot of overlaps with Gnostics and with the like ancient Gnostics and medieval witches, where I don't see much of that at all. Other than in a broad sense, to borrow from Brian, under this idea of a religion with no name, which is what I took, and you'll correct me if I'm butchering it, but it's just this general idea that these plants and fungi can actually bring us into communion with these otherworldly beings, deities, whatever we want to call them. But other than that, like take just like the mystery of the Light Maiden, which is one of the Gnostic rites that we have some pretty decent evidence for, and decent evidence for cannabis use during it. When I read that, and then I read what like Sibilia de Fraguliati was doing in Italy, like they're two totally different things to me, other than entering into this sacred space. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, does anybody want to, kick me in the face about that real quick? Educate me a little bit better on this.
No, I don't think I disagree. I focused on Italy a lot, as you know, in the book, for the same reason that I focus on Dionysus, which is why I focus on Dionysus versus the other Near Eastern fertility cults. Because I think that's where people get in trouble with the pagan continuity hypothesis. It makes so much sense to focus on Dionysus and that Dionysian Gospel, some hits being better than others, because what you do find in Italy at the roots of the Catholic Church, what you do find are very Greek mysteries. I mean, if you'd be hard pressed to find more fertile territory for Demeter, Persephone, or Dionysus than Magna Graecia, than Great Greece in southern Italy. And so that spiked wine archaeobotanical find was important for me, because I'm not saying there's this unbroken continuity from from outside Pompeii to Benevento 1,500 years later. But it's awfully interesting. It's awfully interesting that when Andres Laguna is talking about the Witches Ointment, he does mention henbane and black nightshade, which were also found in those wine jars there. So I don't think the Gnostics became the witches, but I think it's more of the sense of that religion of sacred pharmacology. That survives in Italy in particular, but you can trace it very well in Italy.
Yeah, it's funny. The reason I focus on Italy is because I can read Italian and not German. That was that was it. Like, I was more limited by ignorance than anything else. But But you also get, I mean, Italy, in my opinion, is also, with my research, like that's where the birth of the witch stereotype really formed, and you kind of get into that a little bit towards the end of your book, Brian.
Well, thanks to you, Tom. I mean, your writing in the Witches Ointment is just that. I mean, that was a big aha moment for me. I gotta be honest. In the course of my research, it really tuned me into the possibility of some kind of continuity from whatever was happening in Paleo Christianity to the early modern period. Because again, for me as a Catholic, Italy is kind of ground zero, and to be able to trace that influence in the Witches Ointment, I think for me was very meaningful.
Well, there's also, you'd mentioned Magna Graecia. There's that amazing, I don't remember, it's a vase or some kind of painting or something, but Ruck brought, I think in Dionysius in Thrace, in one of his later books that he wrote. And I mean, it clearly shows Dionysius with most likely Persephone and Demeter, and he's wearing an opium crown.
Oh yeah.
You've seen that one, right? See, that's another reason why I think that the Entheogenic Eleusis was opium based off of the Minoan poppy goddess coming up to Eleusis from the Minoan civilization, and then getting passed on through the birth of Dionysus as the child of Persephone, which you write about, Brian, and almost kind of passing the crown, so to speak, to him.
Ooh. I like
I don't know if you have any thoughts.
I had a chapter on opium, by the way, which I cut.
What?
Yeah,
They're so.
No, I went to the Archaeological Museum in Heraklion to look at the poppy goddess herself. Yeah. I spent a week at the Dumbarton Oaks Library in Georgetown in Washington, D.C., making photocopies of that poppy crown. I mean, I got really into it for a while.
Yeah. And what happened, if you don't mind my asking? You lost.
I'm not Barack Obama, and I can't afford a 700-page book.
Okay, that's true. That's a good point.
He can get away with it.
Yeah, right. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think there may be something to be fleshed out in regards to witches and Gnosticism. It's like the reversals, particularly, and the use of ointments, but it's not something I'm solid on by any means. I think there's other avenues for Gnostic influences into Europe, though. You certainly know that one of the Templar Grand Masters was using Abraxas as a sigil, you know what I mean, like a stamp. Gnostic Abraxas, you know what I mean? So where did he get that from, And that fits with a lot of the heresies the Gnostics, the Templars were confused of. And in regards to those heresies, what do you make of all the sex stuff in early Gnosticism? The accusations of Hippolytus, Augustine, Irenaeus against Gnostic spermatosia, as it's often called. And the sex rites and the Eucharist indicated in that, and in texts like the Question of Mary, now lost to history. You didn't touch on that. It's a gooey subject. I don't blame you.
Yes, he does. It was one of the things I saw when you were in the catacomb. Where was it? When there were the people in the banquet, and they had the line "Messe, mix it up."
Right, that's in the catacombs of Saint Pietro.
Yeah, that's okay. So when when pagans would condemn Christians for having these orgies and stuff, that's what they said the Christians would shout out was meslet, mix it up. And then, according to the pagan authors, fathers would embrace their daughters, brothers would embrace their sisters. Oh, these terrible Christians! You do not want to have anything to do. And it was, so in a way, Brian, you did kind of touch upon that. Did you know that that's what they were talking about with meslet? That.
Yeah, and mixing it up, and the same kind of aspersions you would hear about the witches later on. Yes. By the way,
yes,
and the same Bacchanal turned Black Sabbath.
Yes.
I mean, it's fascinating stuff. I mean, there's lots of ways with miske, which is cognate with lots of different words that go back into Greek and Indo-European. But it was shocking for me to see that written on the catacomb wall.
Dude, it was shocking for me to see it in your book. I was like, holy shit, it's right there.
Yeah, it's right there.
Yeah.
It's news to me too, man. That's awesome. I'm glad you pointed that out, Tom, because I read it. I read the Mix It Up stuff, and I didn't connect it. It's so long ago. I think I covered the sex cults of Gnosticism more thoroughly than I've seen anywhere else by far in my book, Sex, Drugs, Violence, and the Bible. I went through everything I could find on that stuff. And it's pretty weird, but I missed that. I missed that mix it up. I knew about the saying now that you mentioned it and refreshed my memory, but I mixed that in, and that is at the agape. There's a great book about Paul and Corinth saying that the Corinthians were Gnostics and that what was taking place was at the agape, the love feast, was these same-sex rights. And there's elements of this from Canaanite culture as well, right? Like this could have been a carryover. Gnosticism itself, could have developed pre-Christian. That's an idea numbers of scholars have had as a rejection of the failure of the Jewish religion to uphold, you're supposed to worship God, good things were supposed to happen. And that didn't fucking happen, so people were questioning shit, you know what I mean? And once stuff got translated into Greek, they're reading all these other religious texts, and this is the birthplace of Gnosticism here, and it's pre-Christian. That's one view.
Yeah, well, let's actually get back to Corinth for a moment, because there's an interesting divergence that we have with Paul's letter to the Corinthians when he talks about how the Eucharist is making them weak, ill, or dying. Brian and I are on the side that he means literal death. Whereas Bennett, you're on the side that he's talking about a spiritual death. If I'm not mistaken.
I don't know enough. I was asking you about that. I had thought that it was spiritual death, but if you take a look at Pliny's writings on love filters, he points out that people taking these love filters sometimes died from their misuse. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah.
And specifically, right? You know what I mean?
Oh,
so,
yeah.
and these are love filters that we're talking about in Marcus and likely in Agape at the love feast.
Yeah,
So it could well have been a preparation like the one Brian found first century AD, and something like that. You fuck with, you start fucking with daturas and henbanes, you can stop your heart. No question about it,
God,
so
opium.
It could be. I just thought it was a spiritual death.
Sure. There's also, like Apollodorus and Plutarch, with the whole love filter thing, they say specifically that these drugs are ruining people's minds, that it's really messing them up. And the idea, because again, it's, I believe in the Greek, and Brian, you'll correct me, he doesn't say weak, ill, or dying, he says weak, ill, or having fallen asleep, right? But it's in the context of dying. Am I wrong about that?
No, you're right. So the verb is koimontai. In modern Greek, you'd say kimontai. It's a weird word. It's the same verb that's used, interestingly, Chris, for the resurrection of Lazarus. So in the Lazarus miracle, it's the idea, and it's actually a really funny passage, because Jesus says that Lazarus has fallen asleep, hence the need to revive him. And the disciples are basically, in Greek, it's really funny. The disciples say, "Oh, don't worry, he'll wake up soon." And Jesus is like, "He's fucking dead, you idiots!" I said koimontai, he's dead. That's why I read koimontai in Corinthians the same way. It seems like there's some kind of lethal wine being passed around. It's not a crazy reading.
No, I thought the same thing.
Well, we are dealing with death and rebirth ceremonies, like death and rebirth ceremonies that mimic death. Interestingly, in the 19th century, there was a famous trick of fakirs where they get buried in the ground for a week and then come out, and they'd be all like frozen like this, and their servants would come and start pulling their arms out, massaging them, and they'd wake up. And it was a well-known fakir trick. And the guy, Dr. James Bray of Edinburgh, wrote a tractate, Trance and Human Hibernation. And he suggested what they were taking was a preparation of cannabis combined with yogic techniques to achieve this death-like state. And O'Shaughnessy, when he was writing about cannabis medicines in the early period, he would describe people going into a cataleptic state. They were doing really powerful tinctures, right? And they would be frozen like this, and you could put their arm up like this, like that, and you can perform operations on them and stuff as well. And so their heart rate drops, their breathing drops down, and they're in this like rigid physical state, which could well mimic death, you know what I mean? And be described as death for ritual purposes, because we're dealing with death and rebirth ceremonies.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Actually, one of the things that I found somewhat interesting is that, so this idea of keeping the entheogens out of the actual Eucharist itself, and kind of replacing it, so to speak, with, grape juice and crackers, saltine crackers or whatever. when you read medieval Christian literature, however, they didn't have much a problem talking about using these substances at all. They just seem to want to keep it out of the Eucharist in an odd way. I mean, they don't mention it being in a Eucharist or anything, but they do talk about them. And it's this thing that I cannot wrap my brain around unless they felt that the Eucharist was this, well, it's obviously a special thing, but separable from, let me tell you, let me give an example. In the Trupiter Hohelied, which dates to around 1160, the author, whoever she was, writes this very just eye-opening Christian mystery using mandrake symbolism and talking about the effects of mandrake, but through this Christian mystical lens. And I was thinking to myself, well, whoever this person was, like, she didn't have a problem talking about mandrake. Origen writes about using mandrake. Thomas of Persane talks about this stuff. Theodoret smoked opium and says, oh, I like to smoke opium and read from the Gospels. So it's like there seems to have been this effort to keep the Eucharist itself, free of any entheogen, at least with some, Orthodox sensibilities. But as far as people having access to these medicines, the church by and large didn't really care. Like one of the things in listening to your interview, Brian, with Joe Rogan, that Graham Hancock had mentioned was he kept talking about this absolute suppression of these plants and fungi through history. And with respect, I don't know what he's talking about. I mean, it's all over the medieval landscape. Maimonides himself says that I believe that cannabis was the most widely used pharmacon of his day.
It didn't entirely disappear.
Different times, different places.
Sure.
Yeah.
Brian, what was that?
No, just it didn't entirely disappear. There was always a tension from the church fathers on about the right Eucharist and the wrong Eucharist.
Sure.
And in different places at different times, it comes down differently. Was there a general sense of suppression or at least de-entheogenizing the Eucharist? I think that's probably a fair statement, which is not to say that it was that big of a concern. And you point this out. I don't think it really became a concern amongst the witches, for example, until the Witches Ointment started, raising hackles when it was being confused with the Eucharist, right? In the Errores Gazariorum, right? In the 1420s, 1430s.
I have a different interpretation of that. I wouldn't say it was being confused for the Eucharist. In the Aurores, I would say it has more to do with using, or not just the Aurores, but the entire body of literature. It has less to do with actually using the ointment and more to do with using the ointment to worship a female deity. It's far more, in my opinion, a suppression of again, the sacred feminine than it is a suppression of entheogens, because they, like, Guillaume Battista della Porta, he writes about using these psychoactives and stuff, and it's weird. What's interesting that in his first edition of Natural Magic, he writes about all these different uses for mandrake, henbane, opium, and he also writes about the Witches Ointment. And then this French jurist named Jean Baudin accused him of witchcraft for writing about the Witches Ointment. And in future editions of Natural Magic, the Witches Ointment has been excised from it, but all the other drug preparations are still there, which suggests to me, again, not a suppression of the plants themselves, but a suppression of this female-centered religion, if that makes sense.
I like it. With apologies,
Yeah, different times.
a cliffhanger. I have to run to another call, unfortunately.
Oh, okay. Damn. All right.
Apologies for that.
No, of course. Well, we've been going for almost 2 hours now. So, okay, let's get into closing, positions on things and wrapping it up. And let's try to keep it quick for you, Brian. So why don't we start with you and take us out.
I think this is one of the more detailed conversations I've had on the ancient pharmacopoeia in a while. You guys know your stuff. It's interesting that we all approach it from different angles, but I feel like we're all drawn to the same mystery. So I'd love to do this again.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you for being with us, Brian. I appreciate it. Mr. Bennett?
Well, what you were saying, I just wanted to say there's different things in different places. You got like 12th, 13th century popes that 13th century pope that wrote about a cannabis infused medicine. Centuries later, you got some guy comparing the sinner to the cannabis plant in a long essay, some witch hunter. So it's like different areas, different times. It's like different things happened. You know, it's not like one solid history. And thanks for having me. It's been great connecting with Brian after hearing all the hype and, you know, finally getting down and reading his book. And always a pleasure talking with you, Tom. Oh, yeah. And hopefully we all get together, man. You guys should come out to Soma Institute. We'll do a show here. And peyote's legal here in Canada, as along with other substances. So, Brian, you could partake here quite legally without doing any sort of criminal minds. It's a beautiful place for it. And we'd be good company for that.
And the good news is, I don't care about legal status of anything. Gaia has decreed that we all get to take these medicines. So, but anyway, on that, absolutely. I just wanted to say this was absolutely fantastic. Brian, the Immortality Key, absolutely fantastic. I highly recommend everybody out there pick it up seriously. The writing is absolutely gorgeous. It flows very well. There's a great story to the whole thing, and there's some really sound research as well to back it all up. And I want to thank you guys so much. I would absolutely love to do this again. I mean, Brian, like the two of you, that's the thing why I want to do it, the two of you. Every time we talk, we'll just go on for hours and never stop. But yeah, thank you guys so much. And I'll stop because you got to get to another call. I'm Tom Hatsis, a psychedelic historian. I want to thank you all for listening to this latest Psanctum Oddcast. And until next time, mwah, peace. Oh, and links and descriptions will be in the show notes, so that you can get in touch with these fabulous and brilliant authors who I am honored to call friends and colleagues. So with that, I'm going to...
Absolutely. Take care, brothers.
You too, brother. Thank you all so much for stopping by. Sorry it got a little cut off abruptly at the end there, but I hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as the three of us enjoyed having the conversation. And please check out Brian Muraresku's work, Chris Bennett's work, and hell, if you have a little bit of time, my work as well. Links are going to be in the show description. And until next time, I'm Tom Hatsis from Psanctum Psychedelia, bringing you the Psanctum Oddcast and all things psychedelic renaissance. Till next time, peace.